Today we want to talk about fresh approaches to ministry in a postmodern world. We are looking at various contemporary approaches starting last week, this week, and then again next week, all of which are taking our changing world seriously. But in addition, I encourage you to explore them more deeply for yourself so that you can evaluate each on its own merits. I've attempted to post recent material for both for those who promote a given approach as well as those who have reservations. So you'll see our material section under optional reading uh, very much loaded with material. I'm not expecting you to read everything. I wanted you to have availability to this material, and if something really excites you, it gives you resource to look at it more deeply. The first one I want to look at is the megachurch and the multi-site model. And we're going to spend most of our time looking at this model simply because the megachurch is not going away anytime soon unless serious persecution breaks out. The church is growing rapidly, and this seems to be the most current and the most rapidly expanding of the various models. According to a recent study put out by the Hartford Institute for Religious Research, churches with a weekly attendance of 2,000 or more, that's a definition for a megachurch, 2,000 regular attenders or more, grew from only 50 churches in 1970, we're talking only in the US here, 50 churches in 1970 to 1,350 churches in 2015, the most recent figures that I was able to get a hold of. Further, from 2009 to 2014, megachurches reported significant growth, with 71% saying their growth was 10% or more. That's 71% of churches running over 2,000 said their growth in the last 5 years had been 10% or more. 39% said that 10 to 49% growth had taken place, and 19% said 50 to 99% growth took place. And 13% of megachurches said they had doubled in the last 5 years, over 100% growth. Yet while they are reporting that they are growing, actual attendance peaked in 2008 and has been declining since. As you can see in the PowerPoint, I've given you all these figures. The overall average average attendance in 2000 was 2,279. Now you have to understand, we're taking churches that run 2,000 people or larger. All churches running 2,000 or larger. What is the average attendance of those churches? In 2000, it was 2,279. In 2008, only 8 years later, it had multiplied to 4,142. So the attendance of megachurches had doubled in 8 years. However, in 2010, only 2 years later, it had dropped to 3,800. And in 2014, again, the most current figures that I could find, it had dropped to 2,696. In other words, there was a rapid increase for a number of years, and since 2010, there's been a rapid drop-off. So you've got an incongruency here that with a majority of churches running over 2,000, mega churches, saying they've seen significant growth in their churches, yet actual attendance counts have dropped by not quite half. A new study found that while the megachurches are adding congregants, the reported size of how many people call this home, the worshipers actually are attending less frequently. We talked about this earlier in the class, that they've gone to maybe 3 times a month to only twice a month, in turn driving weekly attendance down significantly. So they say they're larger, but less people are actually showing up each week. Thus, more people are associating with the megachurch, but becoming less faithful in attendance. Which of course begs the question, is this simply an overall cultural trend, or is it the consequence of the megachurch approach to ministry where they feel it's okay to attend less often? And nobody knows the answer to that. A multi-site. Initially, megachurches began to explore ways of continuing their expansive growth through opening new venues, which became known as an extension campus of a multi-site church. Now, there was a number of reasons. A good example would be in Foursquare, Church on the Way was one of the earliest multi-site churches in the U.S. And that was simply because they had enlarged their campus to the complete capacity so that neighbors on either side refused to sell them property. So even if they could have vacated streets because they were right up to the streets and enlarged, there were neighbors who said, we are not going to sell to the church. So the church had no potential for growth, but the church was growing. It had a campus that sat maybe 750 people, but the church was growing into the multiple of thousands and was running to that it was being restricted because of the lack of facilities. Meanwhile, one of the largest churches in America moved out to the suburbs just down the street, a mile or so, and it sold its building to Church on the Way. So for a season, Pastor Jack would get in his car, and of course this is before the ability to projection abilities, and so he would preach one service. Then while they were preaching, they'd have service in the other campus. He'd jump in his car and drive down the street and have that campus. And so initially, mega churches were looking at ways of getting more people. And some churches had the ability in certain areas to grow super large campuses, but other areas for city or location or maybe urban areas, there was no possibility of expanding the church campus. And so they had to be creative. But in doing that, they began to realize, hey, we can do this. We can do church in multiple locations. With the increase in technology, it made it possible to feel like the pastor was present. So they would have a whole length, not just a video on a screen, but they would actually have a large screen and you could see the pastor walking back and forth as if he was actually there. And since in many of the very large auditoriums, you didn't watch the person on stage anyway, you simply watched the screens on either side because they were it was too big to actually see the person. It felt like the pastor was actually there. More recently, however, the trend has been to appoint a local campus pastor, both to oversee the campus as well as to preach the message. So currently, and this is so new, this is all really within the last 20 years, really most of it in the last 10 years, many different hybrid approaches are coming out, and it's kind of sorting through what is the most effective. Currently, many various approaches can be found at multi-site campuses, with some showing a video still every week from the main campus. That's probably still especially done in the in rural locations or smaller locations where they want the higher quality of a better speaker than maybe would be willing to go into a smaller location. Which can be live or delayed, but almost always there's a local worship team where they're not showing the worship on the video feed. While others have a local pastor preach, as I just mentioned. Some require the same sermon. The pastor will actually write a sermon several weeks in advance, and they'll send it out to the local pastors with, here's my sermon, preach it as is, or maybe here it is, here's my sermon, but you can add your own life examples or local examples from your community, while others allow the local campus pastor to prepare his own message so that what's going on at the local campus really is unrelated to the main campus. The multi-site approach is growing exponentially, so that it is reported that in 2015, 62% of megachurches were multi-site. That's more than half of all megachurches are multi-site as of 2015. And 3 years later, I would guess that it's significantly increased even since then. However, to refine the numbers, and 2015 is the newest I've been able to get so far, the larger the church, the more likely it is to be multi-site. So in churches of 1,000 to 5,000, 19% are multi-site. Between 5,000 and 10,000, 38%. Between 10,000 and 15,000, 74% are multi-site. And of churches 15,000 and larger, 94% are multi-site. Those who have already gone multi-site average, however, 2.3 locations. And over the past 5 years, multi-site churches had a 74% growth rate versus a 38% growth rate for churches with only one location. So they've doubled their growth rates by being multi-site. However, an interesting fact that I discovered was that 85% of multi-site churches don't launch more than 2 satellite campuses. So the standard multi-site church consists of 3 or 4 campuses. It's quite significant that 85% of multi-site churches only have a total of 3 campuses, including their main campus. Of course, there are other, especially in the very large churches, that may have, like Saddleback, I understand, has over 40 satellite campuses. And I know in Foursquare, The Rock has, I think, in excess of 20 at this point. 20% of multi-site churches have closed a campus or cut it loose. I wanted to compare that because I'm in church planting, and I know that the current church planting rate, both in Foursquare and nationally, is about a 70% success rate or about a 30% closure rate. So in church planting, starting with absolutely nothing, currently at 5 years, 4 to 5 years, approximately 70% of all church plants will make it, or 30% will close. Well, currently, of multi-site churches that have established a campus, so far 20% of them have closed it or cut it loose. So the failure rate on multi-site is about 20%, of church plants is around 30%. Well, the larger church has more resource to put in than many of what we're seeing with the smaller church, and have a greater commitment to keep following up after it. And also, the multi-site is so new that we don't necessarily have 5 years history to see what's going to happen, to see if that will normalize. However, to refine the numbers, for those campuses that were closed, by far the main reason given was low attendance, with 82% saying they closed their campus because of low attendance. Other key reasons include a change of leadership, 32%. The campus was too expensive to maintain, 29%. The offerings were insufficient, 21%. Or the location was bad, 21%. And there's other, but I didn't give the other figures because we don't know what those are. For those that released a campus, by releasing a campus, they didn't close it. They just let the campus go its own way and moved on, so they were no longer associated. Those did so to allow it to become a self-sustaining, autonomous church. 48% allowed it. They said, we want to be our own church, and they said, God bless you, here you are, and 48% did that. 35% left because the campus diverted from the multi-site church's vision. So the church was saying, we're going this way, and they began to diverge. And they said, okay, you're not a part of us anymore. You're not staying in connection with this, 35%. 9%, the church had theological differences, which probably means the campus pastor started proclaiming his own teaching, and the main campus had to cut them off. Or 13% had a differing opinion on how to run the campus. So friction became between the campus and the large church, and they just cut them loose and said, you want to go your own way, fine, do it. The median seating capacity, I found this interesting, of the largest sanctuary on the main campus is 750. That's for the 1,350 churches that run 2,000 people or more. When you add all those churches together and ask the middle point, what half of all those churches have, the median size of their largest sanctuary on their main campus is 750 people. So these mega churches don't have mega buildings for the most part. A few do, but most of them have a 750 size building is a large capacity, but not for a church of thousands of people, maybe 5,000, 10,000 people. With 99% holding multiple weekend services. I think the average was 5 different services they hold on the weekend. 49% say these services varied by style or type. So that means of their multiple services that the mega churches have, 49% say their services are different by style of music or type or organization, so they gave great variety, an opportunity for variety. Multi-site locations are generally much smaller, with 52% of multi-sites starting in rented spaces, having an average of 125 people to start and growing to between 200 and 350 people. So most multi-site locations are much smaller than the main campus. That's not always true, and some of the churches are able to reproduce multi-sites that are huge, of multiple thousands, but that's not the norm. More recently, churches have begun to acquire new campuses through church mergers. That is whereby a smaller congregation, for whatever reason, folds into the main church, who in turn rebrands the church as its own. In 2015, again, the newest year that I have figures for, 37% of all new campuses were coming about through a merger, although the trend seems to be growing since it is much less expensive to take over established facilities with a core of people than to start from nothing. Megachurches are adopting virtual campuses as well, which we'll discuss next week when we talk about the virtual campus or the internet church. With now 25% of, in fact, in 2015, 25% of megachurches had an online presence with an average weekly attendance of 182 online. And I'm sure that has substantially grown more recently. A third of those having a virtual campus has assigned staff whose primary role is to serve the online congregants. In other words, megachurches not only have an online presence, but now they have staff members who are paid to do nothing but serve that online congregation. What started as a necessary move to increase space for a growing mega congregation has now become an intentional methodology for advancing the church beyond its formal circle of influence. And while I didn't provide the stats, they say something like 49% of young pastors who are pioneering or beginning church or taking churches, not necessarily large churches, 49% of young pastors say that in their future they believe that they're going to have multi-site campuses. So the youth have fully adopted this, young pastors have fully adopted this. Whereas in the beginning, a new campus was established to make it easier for congregants who drove a considerable distance each week to attend a closer service or to enlarge their main campus. Now campuses are being established wherever a productive place for ministry is envisioned, so that the multi-site model has become the tool of choice for expansion and growth. As the multi-site model comes of age, vision is growing beyond past boundaries, so that many are establishing campuses across state lines and in various environments, not only in urban and suburban areas, but also rural areas as well, so that currently 47% of multi-site churches have a campus in a small town or rural area, which is significant when you realize that the vast majority, 85% of multi-site churches only have a total of 3 campuses. 47 or almost a percent or almost half have a campus in a small or rural area. And one wonders how quickly in the near future we're going to begin to see multi-site churches go international, so that, for example, Filipino churches, instead of sending Filipino pastors, maybe they'll send campus pastors and start establishing campuses around the United States, or the U.S. pastors will send out to expats or others internet churches throughout the world. Internet campuses throughout the world, or even campus pastors throughout the world. I want to take a few minutes and evaluate this, and I'm kind of got mixed feelings on this. The research, I think, is mixed. Part of the problem, it is so new that everybody knows the short term, but everyone's a little bit unsure of what the long-term effects of 20, 30, 50 years down the line will be. And I guess I've lived long enough that I can remember back when everyone was promoting the new method, everybody was adopting it, it was the way to go. And now everybody looks at it and says, oh, that's so awful. Look how it's hurting the church. So I think time will only tell. So I've given us a significant number of strengths of this. And I did some research and have a number of common concerns. And not all the strengths, not all the concerns are mine. I've kind of tried to assess where I see people saying and kind of give a full evaluation here. So let's look at the strengths. The strengths of the multi-site church is it utilizes current advances in technology. It takes full usage of what's going on and it brings that out. And so it's much more rapid to adapt, and so in a new location it can come with all the bells and whistles and technological advances that existing churches may be slow to adopt, which can be attractive to congregants. It expands the possibilities of growth beyond traditional space location limitations. So now the possibilities of growth are almost limitless to one's imagination and resources. Third, it reproduces a proven and effective ministry. Some churches, some pastors have proven they're effective in ministry. Some of that is really good, that God has graced them greatly. Some may be questionable in how they approach ministry, and just because something works doesn't necessarily mean it's godly. And so I think there needs to be kind of a prophetic correction here, that we shouldn't just adopt everything because lots of people go to it. But it does reproduce a proven and effective ministry. It establishes a church with significant resources and trained personnel. We said earlier that the average congregation started with 125 to 150 people, and many of the churches will start with 250, especially at location or even at distance. They'll go in and create with such advertising and such buzz and put so much resources in that when they start way beyond what a typical church plant is able to do. And so they have the resources, and they can send staff and interns and all kinds of resources to make that church work. Well-known ministries often have great name recognition, which it enhances its ability to gain attention and attract people to more quickly create critical mass for a new congregation. So the hottest church that everybody's talking about in America can come to your town with a big flash and lots of advertising and sending key resources to make sure that what you've seen on TV or heard about is reproduced in your area. And so that name recognition can make the church more effective in establishing campuses. Here's an interesting figure. Most campus pastors are raised up within the church rather than hired from without. Thus creates a pathway for leadership development and deployment. It also helps reproduce the ethos, the cultural environment of the main church, because those who have absorbed it then go out to reproduce it. Churches that have tried hiring campus pastors from without, they've seen a lot of difficulty with that, and it's been harder to attract and slower to grow. Next point, it increases lay involvement, which you might think it doesn't, but multiple studies have shown that when they start a campus location, that they have a much higher rate of lay involvement, at least in its early stages in ministry, than at the main campus. And it could be asked, is it because they're forced to it, or is it because that it becomes then a smaller church that's a piece of a larger church, and that just like most smaller churches, more people are needed, and therefore lay involvement is greater. Multi-site campuses grow faster than other types of churches, with an average of 28% growing the first year, with an average growth rate of 25, let me turn off that speaker, it keeps, there we go. Multi-site campuses grow faster than other types of churches. The average multi-site campus grows 28% the first year, 25% the second year, and then accumulation of 14% every year thereafter, at least for a season. So they tend to grow faster than other churches. The approach allows for significant flexibility in expanding the reach of a church. So whereas before the reach was only within its driving distance, now the reach again is limitless. Next, when a multi-site campus stumbles, the main campus can provide fresh resources, personnel, and vision to get the multi-site back on track. So if something's not working, or the people are getting burned out, often in a church plant, after the first year or two being in a mobile location, people begin to burn out and leave. In a multi-site church, they can send new interns in and bring the old interns back, and they can just keep pumping in fresh blood into that campus. Next, a new campus will reach more unchurched people than the original campus does. Just like church planting reaches more unchurched people, when they've tracked unchurched people, they find that more unchurched people are being reached in the new campus than in that same church's original campus. There's something about a church campus, as a church as it establishes itself, it becomes less effective in reaching unchurched people. And finally, millennials prefer smaller venues than larger ones. So the multi-site church will be more effective at reaching this generation over having only one large campus. Again, the younger generations are not so enthralled with the mega places as much as the boomers were, and so they're looking for smaller venues, and so consequently it's a way that the mega church can continue to renew itself by having venues that are preferred by the younger generations. Okay, those are all the reasons why multi-site church is effective. But there are some common concerns that are raised. Some of them you may just smile at or wink off. Others should give at least some pause. I found these in blogs and articles and publications and in various places. But let's look at them. And I have almost as many concerns as I have promotions. A multi-site church or campus does not have a clear biblical basis. The multi-site church is united through its budget, its lead pastor, its administration, its governance, and its brand identity. However, all of those ideas are foreign to the New Testament church. You don't see the New Testament church saying that those are our campuses. They recognized and affirmed all those churches throughout the New Testament as separate churches. Secondly, it's based upon the multi-site church is based upon a corporate model of building a business empire, which by definition is in competition with other similar businesses, churches, which is completely foreign to biblical Christianity. Third, it is not really one church, but a collection of churches under one administration. As such, it bypasses the normal processes of denominational oversight. In addition, leadership structures such as a council or elder body are not local for extension campuses. And again, you're thinking out in the future when the church realizes that all the decisions made for that church is made elsewhere and not made within that local congregation. Another one, it can restrict a local campus in its ability to address local issues or to use locally understood illustrations that apply the gospel most effectively to seekers, especially when there's a video feed. In the same way, it can also restrict the local campus in its ability to grow, because if the main church is resourced shy, it may be unwilling to pump additional resource into that campus that otherwise, if it was an independent church, it would find resource to address and to grow. It can view people as a means to an end, that is church growth, rather than the focus of ministry. It can be about building our mega church rather than about reaching the lost. It has the potential to make believers into passive watchers of media rather than active participants in a dynamic community of God. It is an unnatural manner of reproduction. A body does not reproduce by adding another leg or another arm or another body that is still connected and that I can control, as much as we would like to control our children. A body reproduces by completely reproducing itself into something that has got full autonomy. I have a child, I raise up that child. Sometimes that child rebels a little bit, and eventually that child is on its own, for good or bad. That's the way that God created things, for things to reproduce. We don't clone ourselves, we reproduce ourselves, and then for good or for bad, for righteous or for evil. That's not ours to judge, but to give life and to release. And so therefore, multi-site is unnatural in trying to control rather than release. By limiting rising leaders as campus pastors, the next generation is being held back from their full potential as leaders in their own right. They're cogs in a wheel, and the next generation now, the average multi-site pastor is 52, I read, and the average campus pastor is 42. So a whole generation that's in their prime of leadership is being held as campus pastors and not given the opportunity to be their own leaders. Next, there's uncertainty about what happens when the campus pastor or the campus desires to become its own autonomous church. Some have said, bless you, and we saw the stats for that. Some have said, bless you, while others have said, thank you very much for your service, but we invested all of our resources in that place and it belongs to us. And so bless you as you go. We're going to appoint the next campus pastor. It is also uncertain what will happen when the charismatic founding pastor is no longer leading the church. Many large and empty church buildings today are a testament to a former season and leader. We've begun to see this already with a number of key large church pastors stepping down. The Crystal Cathedral from however many years ago sold its property to the Catholics, and it's no longer the church that it was. Mars Hill, just a couple years ago, had a meltdown with its leader. Its leader stepped down, and interestingly enough, the elders of Mars Hill, and there was, I think, 7 satellite campuses, many of which were not in close proximity, and most of which were well over 1,000 people in attendance, which was really an exception. There was one in our area that had about 2,000 people, and the elders said, "We give you the church. We give you the property. We give you all the resources. We give you all the equipment. We give you all the congregation. We give you everything." And I think all but 2 of the satellites, or I believe 5 of the 7 satellites, said, "Thank you very much, but if you're not going to pay the bills and do all the work and send us all the stuff that you have, we have no interest whatsoever." And so they stood up the next Sunday and told their thousands of people, "I'm sorry, but we're closing as a church, goodbye," and closed up and shop, because if they weren't going to get their salary and their support and everything from the main campus, they weren't interested. And then that's true. I mean, it actually happened. And so it begs the question, if that could happen in such incredibly one of the largest churches in America, at the floundering of its leader, what will happen when you have thousands of churches that are of this size, as this next generation of leaders, as they begin to step down? What will happen with all of the church in its future? We're seeing even this week, Willow Creek is walking through a significant crisis with all of its senior leaders and elders resigning just this week. And one of the campus pastors being brought in as the interim pastor. Well, they sort out and say, where are we going to go? And what's going to happen next week? And is the church even going to survive? And so these questions are critical questions that need to be addressed. And finally, the possessiveness of the ministry, our ministry, our church, brings everything into an ours and a yours mentality, rather than it all belongs to Christ. Thus, resources that used to be shared with other churches in need are now kept back to be utilized for the next Extension campus, so that resources are no longer released and church planters are no longer sent out. Well, that's a quick look at the multi-site church and some of the positives and some of the concerns that need to be addressed. There's 2 other areas I want to look at: discipleship and apprenticeship. Due to the criticism that has been leveled in the last 15, 20 years of the weak status of American Christianity, many have taken seriously the need for effective discipleship. And so I wanted to talk just quickly, what is a discipleship-focused church? Three things that I see. It takes seriously the Great Commission to make disciples as the primary focus of ministry. It addresses the serious, current, lackluster faith and obedience often found in the church. In other words, that we're educated beyond our obedience. Third, it focuses more on the life formation than the acquisition of knowledge. Discipleship approaches, and I've given 4 basic approaches to discipleship. Maybe more of a traditional approach to discipleship is a teaching approach. They work students through levels of classes or a series of classes. Some maintain Bible institutes for that purposes, for discipleship training and training of leaders and just training of lay people. Disciples are taught foundations for new believers, foundations for becoming a member of the church, instructions on spiritual gifts, basic Bible teaching, basic theological concepts and distinctives, and principles for evangelism, and I'm sure others, but those are the main stones. There's also a different approach, a programmatic approach. A programmatic approach utilizes a standard program to pass students along through levels, declaring those who pass as disciples. And so they might have 5, 6, 7 levels of discipleship. And in these levels, they clearly define what is expected for spiritual growth. You have to memorize scriptures, you have to pray, and they quantify everything. You have to pray for so much. You have to speak in your heavenly language if you're charismatic for so much. You have to journal, read your Bible and journal. You've got to listen to different things. In other words, it's clearly defined, and then every week you're evaluated. Either you did or you didn't, and if you didn't do it, after a while they kick you out of the program and tell you to start over. It works on formation of spiritual disciplines, which is really good. Gets people into the basics like prayer and Bible reading and the like, and sharing your faith. It is reproducible in large systems under varied systems. I know of, for example, The Rock does a programmatic approach, and it has the Rock has thousands of churches and multiple sites, and they reproduce this in their different sites. They reproduce it in their home groups. They reproduce it everywhere. It may lead to a legalistic attitude of outward behaviors at the expense of inward qualities. So I can do these things outside, but have I really dealt with what's in the heart? And that's not so easily dealt with in a program. And the one size fits all doesn't take into account the various stages and needs of individuals. Some are believers coming in, mature believers, who are then run through basically a new believers class, and there have been a solid, faithful believer for 20 years. Maybe they don't quite need that remedial training. Others definitely do. Sometimes you go into a young and postmodern situation as opposed to maybe a Hispanic situation, opposed to maybe a more professional, and that one size fits all may not quite fit in different cultural environments. Okay, an apprenticeship approach. Moving away from an educational model, they've established a hands-on internship programs. Sociology calls this legitimate peripheral participation. I just had to say that. It's just so cool, the sociological term. Legitimate peripheral participation. Don't tell people you have apprenticeship. Tell them you have legitimate peripheral participation program. That'll fly. Okay, participants are trained through hands-on ministry with increasing responsibility as they prove faithful and effective. Often it has a combination of discipleship, educational, and hands-on ministry elements. In Foursquare, the Emerging Leaders Network and the LPC Ignite are great examples of this. The fourth element is what we might call personal discipleship approaches. Some churches have contended that discipleship cannot be found in a program, instead focusing on connecting neophytes with mature believers, where disciples can be made organically. They would contend that Jesus didn't make his disciples go through an internship. He didn't make his disciples go through a program. He didn't make his disciples sit down through classes. He basically just said, "Follow me," and they imprinted who Jesus was, so that true discipleship is more caught than taught. And this approach focuses on one-to-one relationships that it can address individual needs, faults, and shortcomings. The problem with personal discipleship approaches is that it's limited by the number of available disciplers. And some have tried to make it infinitely reproducible by saying, if I'm discipling someone, that they have to disciple someone who disciples someone, and so you get a chain of discipleship going on. The problem is that a disciple cannot lead his followers any further than he is. And so consequently, to have a simultaneous chain down the end of the chain, it might become fairly weak. What I would like to say, however, is that the personal discipleship approach is probably the most biblical. And we see it with Jesus, we see it with the early apostles, certainly see it in the life of Paul. And Paul even teaches that by saying, hand on this gospel to others who will in turn hand it on to even others beyond them. And so it's definitely a scriptural program. Okay, let's move on from the discipleship approach. And one last one I want to just approach quickly is what we might call the Spirit-empowered approach. In the current seeker-focused season, maybe from about the 90s on, there's been a waning of churches that contend for the presence and power of God. And so to way oversimplify kind of the Holy Spirit and in the movements that we've seen in the United States, at least in the last series. You've had the Pentecostal movement that served this purpose for much of the 20th century, starting around 1900 and continuing to the present. But the sense of the Pentecostal church is slowly but surely losing the same sense of vibrancy that was maybe 50 years ago. The charismatic movement brought the winds of the Spirit to Catholic, mainline, and evangelical groups from about the mid-1950s on. And so the Holy Spirit spread and really affected the whole church over time. There was kind of a resurgence in the late 90s through the Vineyard churches, especially, but not only limited to them. And they filled this gap in the early 1990s. But with the death of John Wimber, many of the Vineyard churches are beginning to kind of move away from praying for healing and encouraging a public move of the Spirit. Some are very much involved, but some are kind of calming, just like many of the larger Pentecostal churches have begun to do. And of course, the TV streams and other streams. But with the fall of so many of the mega ministries, the Pentecostal churches, in the same vein as we've seen in other areas, that is beginning to kind of temper. With the growth of the megachurch as a key model of ministry, many Pentecostal churches are softening their emphasis of public manifestations of the Spirit, moving them to alternative services, many, if not most of which have now been canceled. Thus, the vibrancy of the Spirit is seen in public tongues, prophecies, and expressions of the Spirit has greatly abated. However, some still contend for a present and visible engagement of the Spirit within church services, including gifts, healings, and other manifestations. Let's talk about the Spirit-empowered church. Three things. It takes serious the Bible injunction that Spirit empowerment for ministry must precede ministry. It says that to try to go into ministry from just an evangelical sense of I've accepted the Lord without that spiritual empowerment is to lose the Bible emphasis on effectiveness. It understands that postmoderns, millennials, and digital natives, the I generation, are very open to the present reality of the supernatural. I mean, just turn on the TV, anything young, and they've got demons and angels, and they've got it all. They're not shy about the supernatural, so I don't know why, it's almost like the postmoderns are open to the things of the Spirit. It's the moderns who are against the Holy Spirit, but we say we have to be kind of calmed down because of the postmoderns. They want the supernatural, and the devil is not shy in giving it to them. I'm just saying, the devil's not shy in showing them the Spirit. So maybe there's an opportunity for the church to fan again the flames of the Spirit, to burn hotly within the youth that everyone is so concerned about losing. Maybe we're losing them because they don't see anything of presence and power in the church. If we bring back that presence and power of the Spirit, maybe it'll enthrall the next generation who's yearning for such power to be released. Yet there are places where the Spirit still burns hot and bright. One well-known and large church that is leading the way in this area with a solid emphasis and effectiveness on young adults and discipleship to healing and miracles and reproducing this in the younger generation is Bethel Church. And I encourage you to check out iBethel. And then somebody will say, oh, there's so much criticism. Yeah, there's always criticism and questions, but you got to at least give them credit for pressing into this area. And I've heard of incredible testimonies of God's miraculous power working in this church. Okay, to kind of sum up all of this, by the way, the other elements I've moved to next week simply for our time sake. So in conclusion, to their credit, all approaches take the mission of God to reach and disciple the lost seriously. And as I said before, please let go of our attitudes towards others as if our way is right and everyone else is wrong. Everybody is at the best of their ability trying to reach the lost. For the most part, most churches are aware of the changing culture and cultural climate and the sometimes lackadaisical condition of the church and its believers, and are striving to renew ministry and expand the church to reach the unchurched. As mentioned earlier in the class, all this focus, along with the gentle moving of God's Spirit, is having positive effect. And the torrid church statistics of the late 90s and early 2000s are beginning to shift. So let's just continue to pray and contend that God will be alive in our church and in not only in our generation, but in the generations to come. Well, enjoy your reading, exploring this week.